If you've clicked on this video, then you already know this isn't just another Hollywood story. It's not just about beauty, fame, or glamour. It's about what happens when the very thing that makes you a star also becomes the reason for your pain. This is the story of Gene Tierney, a woman whose beauty stunned the world, whose eyes could silence a room, and whose voice carried a sadness that few ever truly understood. To millions, she was a dream, but to herself, she was often a prisoner inside that dream. Gene Tierney's story doesn't begin on a movie set or under the blinding lights of fame. It begins in a quiet, comfortable home in Brooklyn, New York in 1920. Her father, Howard Tierney, was a successful insurance broker, polished, proud, and determined to raise his children with discipline and ambition. Her mother, Belle Lavinia Taylor, was a former teacher, graceful, gentle, but firm in her values. Together, they built a life of refinement and privilege for their children. There was a sense of perfection in the Tierney household. Every gesture, every appearance, every impression mattered. And little Gene learned early that being admired came with expectations. From a young age, Gene was different. Her classmates at the private schools she attended remembered her as quiet, thoughtful, and slightly distant, as if she was always lost in a dream that no one else could see. She loved literature, wrote poetry, and often spent hours reading by the window. She had the face of a doll, but the soul of an artist. Yet no one could have predicted that this reserved young girl, born into New York privilege, would one day become one of Hollywood's most haunting faces. Her beauty wasn't loud or showy. It was the kind of beauty that made people stop mid-sentence, unsure what had just happened to them. Even as a teenager, she carried herself with an elegance that felt otherworldly. There was something classic about her, like she didn't belong to her time, but to some timeless portrait that had suddenly come to life. It was during a family trip to California in the late 1930s that Gene's fate took an unexpected turn. The Tierneys visited a film studio, Warner Brothers, simply as tourists. Gene had no ambitions of becoming an actress. She was merely curious to see how movies were made. But destiny had its own script that day. As she stood quietly on the tour, watching the glittering world of sets and cameras, someone noticed her, a studio cameraman who literally dropped what he was holding. He turned to a colleague and whispered, "Who is that girl? That face? It belongs on film." Within minutes, a studio executive was asking for her name, her background, and if she'd ever considered acting. Gene blushed and smiled politely, thinking it was just flattery. She was shy, even modest about her looks, but the seed had been planted, and Hollywood had begun its pursuit. Back in New York, her parents were skeptical. The movie industry wasn't considered respectable for well-bred girls from good families, but even her father, Howard, couldn't ignore what others saw. When Gene appeared at a society event, photographers couldn't stop taking her picture. Her luminous green eyes, her porcelain skin, and her graceful movements seemed almost too perfect to be real. Before long, a friend suggested she try theater, just to see what happens. And so Gene began acting in local plays, mostly for fun. But when she stepped on stage, something remarkable happened. The audience couldn't look away. Her presence wasn't loud or theatrical. It was quiet, magnetic, and filled with feeling. She didn't act to be seen. She acted to express something deep inside herself, something words alone couldn't hold. In 1938, Gene made her Broadway debut in a play called The Male Animal. The critics noticed her instantly. One review said, "A girl appeared on stage tonight, whose face the camera will one day worship." That prophecy came true faster than anyone imagined. Word spread about the beautiful young woman from New York who seemed born for film. Soon, contracts from Hollywood studios began arriving one after another. And although her parents hesitated, Gene was curious. She wanted to see how far this gift of hers, this strange, almost burdensome beauty, could take her. When she arrived in Hollywood, Gene was just 20 years old. The moment she stepped off the train, reporters were already waiting. They'd heard about the new goddess from the East, and they wanted a glimpse. She smiled shyly as the flashbulbs went off, already feeling a strange tension between the image people saw and the person she really was. She once said, "I was a young girl from a good home who happened to look like a movie star." But that "happened to" would shape the rest of her life. Fox Studios quickly signed her to a contract, and the transformation began. She was groomed, styled, photographed, and prepared to be the next great leading lady. Directors compared her to Garbo, Dietrich, and Vivian Leigh. But Gene didn't want to be anyone else. She wanted to be herself, and that's what made her different. When she appeared in her first few films, audiences noticed something rare. She wasn't acting to impress. She was acting to reveal something honest, something real. That was the beginning of what critics would later call her haunting vulnerability. Her big breakthrough came in 1944 with Laura. It wasn't just a film, it was an experience. In the movie, she played a woman whose beauty and charm linger even after her supposed death. The entire story revolves around her, the idea of her, the mystery of her, the power of her presence. And when Gene appeared on screen, framed by that haunting portrait, audiences fell under her spell. The film became a classic, and Gene Tierney became a legend. But behind that success, she was already beginning to feel the weight of her perfection. Hollywood adored her, but Gene often felt lonely. Fame brought admiration, not understanding. Men were infatuated with her looks, women envied her elegance, and directors wanted to mold her like clay. She smiled for the cameras, attended premieres, and wore the finest gowns. But deep inside, she began to feel hollow. She once confessed, "People used to tell me I had the most beautiful face in the world, but it's a terrible thing to live up to." That line, simple, honest, and heartbreaking, would later define her entire life. As her career soared, her personal life grew more complicated. Gene had many admirers. Howard Hughes, the eccentric billionaire, was one of them. He sent her lavish gifts, wrote her letters, and even flew across the country just to have dinner with her. But despite his charm and power, Gene saw something else in him, a loneliness that mirrored her own. They remained friends for years, even after she turned down his romantic advances. She respected him for one thing, his kindness when her life would later fall apart. But before tragedy entered her life, Gene found love, or what she thought was love. In 1941, she married fashion designer Oleg Cassini, a man as handsome as he was charming. Together they were one of Hollywood's most glamorous couples, beautiful, stylish, envied by all. But behind the glittering facade, their relationship was turbulent. Cassini was passionate and ambitious, but also controlling and unfaithful. Gene wanted stability, a family, peace. Instead, she found herself in a storm of emotions: love, jealousy, hope, and despair. When she gave birth to her first daughter, Daria, Gene was overjoyed. She wanted to be a mother more than she wanted to be a star. But fate, once again, had other plans. During her pregnancy, she made a public appearance at the Hollywood Canteen, a place where stars met soldiers during World War II. One of the women there, a fan who had escaped from a quarantined hospital with rubella, excitedly shook Gene's hand. The woman had no idea that her brief moment of joy would forever change Gene's life. Gene contracted the illness, and when her baby was born, she was severely disabled, both deaf and mentally impaired. Gene never blamed the fan, but she was never the same again. Her heart broke in ways words could never describe. She continued acting, continued smiling, but inside she was drowning. The pain of knowing her child would never live a normal life haunted her every day. She poured that sorrow into her performances, and critics noticed a new depth, a sadness, a fragile humanity that no acting school could ever teach. Her beauty remained, but it was now tinged with something deeper, the beauty of a wounded soul. Hollywood called her the perfect face. But Gene Tierney knew the truth. Perfection is a mask, and behind it, there is always a price. The more people adored Gene Tierney, the more she began to feel like she was living someone else's life. She was praised as the most beautiful woman in the world, and yet she would often stare at herself in the mirror and whisper, "Who are you really?" Beneath the glamour, beneath the soft light that danced across her perfect face, She carried a quiet sadness, a sadness born from the feeling that everything in her life had been decided by others. She didn't chase fame, it found her. She didn't demand admiration, it was forced upon her. And now, she was trapped inside a golden cage, one she could neither escape nor destroy. After her daughter Daria's birth, Gene's world began to crumble, though she tried desperately to hide it. To outsiders, she still appeared radiant, attending premieres, smiling for cameras, moving with grace through a world that demanded perfection. But in private, she cried for hours. She once said in her memoir, Self-Portrait, "When you have a child who is suffering, you stop believing in fairy tales." That single line carried all the weight of her heart. Hollywood could offer her diamonds, fame, and applause, but none of it could heal the sound of her daughter's silence. The 1940s and early 1950s brought both triumph and torment. Professionally, she reached astonishing heights. She starred in Leave Her to Heaven, a role that earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. The film showed a different side of her, the elegant but disturbed Ellen Barrett, a woman consumed by jealousy and obsession. It was a chilling performance, and yet, eerily, it reflected the real emotions Gene was hiding. When she gazed into the camera with those icy, haunted eyes, audiences saw a character. Gene saw herself. She later admitted that playing Ellen felt like looking into the mirror and seeing my own fears. Despite her growing success, her marriage to Oleg Cassini was unraveling. He was charming, yes, but also unpredictable. They fought constantly, about money, about attention, about her career. Gene wanted love, but Cassini wanted control. He wanted the perfect wife, the glamorous, unshakable movie star that Hollywood adored. But he couldn't handle her moments of vulnerability. The more she needed understanding, the less he could give it. They separated and reconciled multiple times, but the trust was gone. When they finally divorced in 1952, Gene described it not as a failure, but as a quiet death. She loved him deeply once, but love that hurts too much eventually turns into survival. Then came another heartbreak. Gene fell in love again, this time with a man who couldn't love her freely. The man was John F. Kennedy, years before he became president. They met at a dinner party in Washington, D.C. He was handsome, charming, and charismatic, and Gene was at her most vulnerable. They began a brief but passionate relationship. Kennedy was captivated by her intelligence and grace. She wasn't just another actress, she was a woman of depth. But there was a problem. He was a rising politician, and marriage to a Hollywood actress could damage his image. When he told her that his political career must come first, Gene's heart shattered. She later wrote, "I had to accept that I would never be the kind of woman he could marry." It was a painful goodbye, and she never fully recovered from it. Years later, when Kennedy became president, she received a letter from him, a simple note wishing her well. But by then, too much had changed. By the mid-1950s, the glamorous image of Gene Tierney was fading. Behind closed doors, she was fighting a silent war with her mind. Depression had taken hold, slowly, like a shadow growing longer each day. The more she tried to act, the harder it became. Lines that once came easily now felt heavy. Smiles that once lit up the screen now felt forced. She began to withdraw, cancelling film commitments and isolating herself from friends. Reporters noticed her absence. The tabloids whispered rumors, nervous exhaustion, romantic heartbreak, Hollywood burnout. But no one truly knew the storm inside her. In truth, Gene Tierney was suffering from severe mental illness, what would later be diagnosed as bipolar disorder. At that time, mental health was still a taboo subject, especially for women in Hollywood. Admitting to such struggles could end a career. But Gene couldn't hide anymore. One day, while shooting a film in 1955, she simply broke down on set. She couldn't remember her lines, couldn't hold back tears, couldn't pretend anymore. The studio called it fatigue. Gene called it something else. The day I stopped being able to wear my mask. Her family, alarmed and desperate to help, admitted her to a mental health clinic. What followed was a nightmare few could imagine. Treatments in those days were primitive and cruel. Gene underwent electroshock therapy, multiple times. She later described it as a living death. The treatments left her disoriented, confused, and unable to remember parts of her life. She would later say that the shocks erased her memories but not her pain. "They gave me the face of a stranger in the mirror," she said softly in an interview years later. "I looked like Gene Tierney, but I wasn't sure I still was." The woman once called the most beautiful in the world now felt broken inside and out. But what made Gene Tierney remarkable wasn't just her suffering, it was her resilience. She didn't disappear completely. Even in her darkest days, she tried to hold on to hope. Her friends in Hollywood, people like Humphrey Bogart and Howard Hughes, reached out quietly to help. Hughes, despite his eccentricities, paid for some of her medical treatments and made sure she was cared for when her finances ran low. Gene never forgot that kindness. She once said, "Howard Hughes was one of the few people who treated me like a person when everyone else saw me as a problem." For several years, Gene lived away from Hollywood in near isolation. She spent time in hospitals, in clinics, and in small rented houses where she could walk in gardens and try to heal. Sometimes she would paint, sometimes write letters she never sent. She longed to see her daughter Daria, but visiting her was painful. "She would smile," Gene once said, "but she didn't know who I was. And that was the hardest part, to be a stranger to your own child." Yet she never stopped loving her. Every flower she painted, every note she wrote, every prayer she whispered, it was always for Daria. By the late 1950s, after years of struggle, Gene slowly began to recover. Medication and gentler therapy had replaced the brutal treatments of the past. She found a sense of calm, not complete happiness, but peace, a fragile kind that comes only after surviving something unspeakable. When she finally returned to the screen in Advised Consent, 1962, audiences were stunned. She was older now, more subdued, but still beautiful, a beauty softened by life, not lit by studio lights, but by endurance. There was wisdom in her face, a quiet grace that only pain can carve. For Gene, acting was no longer about fame. It was about expression, a way to tell the truth, not hide behind it. "When I was young," she once said, "I wanted to be perfect. Now I just want to be real." That simple sentence captured the essence of her transformation. She had gone from a woman trapped in her own image to one who finally understood that imperfection is what makes us human. Still, the scars of her illness lingered. She feared another breakdown, and so she lived carefully, slowly, quietly, avoiding the chaos that once consumed her. She moved to Texas for a time, away from the noise of Hollywood, where she worked in a department store under a different name. Few people recognized her. One day, a former fan did and asked, "Aren't you Gene Tierney?" She smiled softly and replied, "I used to be." That moment captured the essence of her story. A woman who had lost so much, yet somehow kept her dignity intact. As the years passed, Hollywood moved on, as it always does. New faces appeared, new stars rose, and the golden age faded into memory. But for those who remembered, Gene Tierney remained unforgettable. She wasn't just another starlet, she was an artist, a survivor, a woman who paid a heavy price for her gift. And even when she was forgotten by the world, she never forgot what it meant to simply endure. Her later years would bring a kind of redemption, not through awards or applause, but through love and acceptance. She would find peace again, though it came quietly, without fanfare, as all true peace does. As the years drifted by, the dazzling light of old Hollywood began to fade, and so did many of its stars. But for Gene Tierney, the fading light was not a loss. It was a relief. She had spent her youth bathed in that glow, worshipped by millions for her beauty, her poise, her mystery. Now she sought something far more valuable: peace. After the storms that had nearly destroyed her, Gene wanted to live quietly, anonymously if she could. The woman once called the most beautiful face in the world longed to be invisible. After leaving the chaos of California, she moved to Houston, Texas, to live near her family. There she found a strange comfort in ordinary life. She worked part-time at a local department store under a different name, No cameras, no scripts, no applause. She sold perfume and gloves to women who had no idea they were being served by a former Hollywood goddess. For the first time in years, Gene could breathe. She didn't have to pretend to be perfect. She didn't have to smile when her heart was breaking. She could just be a woman living her life quietly, humbly, freely. But even peace has a way of finding cracks in the soul. There were moments when she missed the old days, the thrill of acting, the magic of the studio lights, the music of an orchestra swelling during a romantic scene. Yet she knew she could never go back to that world. Hollywood had given her everything and taken almost as much in return. She had learned that fame, once lost, doesn't return. And sometimes, that's a blessing. It was around this time that fate brought something unexpected back into her life: love. Gene met W. Howard Lee, a wealthy oil man from Texas. He was calm, gentle, and unlike anyone she had ever been with. Ironically, he had once been married to another Hollywood legend, Hedy Lamarr. But his world was far removed from the flashing bulbs and studio drama. Gene and Howard shared something rare. They both had known what it felt like to be admired for the wrong reasons. When they met, she was fragile, unsure of herself, still healing, but Howard didn't see her as Gene Tierney, the star. He saw her as a woman who had been through fire and still managed to stand. Their romance unfolded quietly, away from gossip columns and movie magazines. Howard gave her the one thing Hollywood never could: stability. They would take long walks, share slow dinners, and talk for hours about simple things: books, music, the quiet joy of sunsets. For the first time, Gene didn't have to perform. She could laugh freely, cry openly, and be imperfect without fear. In 1960, they married in a small ceremony, surrounded only by close friends and family. There were no reporters, no flashing lights, just two people choosing peace over spectacle. It was the beginning of Gene's final act, one not written by studios, but by her own heart. Marriage to Howard brought calm to Gene's life. They divided their time between Texas and a quiet home in Houston, where Gene enjoyed painting, gardening, and reading. She loved nature, the stillness of trees, the sound of wind through the leaves, the way the sunlight changed color throughout the day. After years of chaos, those small, simple moments felt sacred. She once told a friend, "I used to chase applause. Now I chase peace and the sound of birds." It was a beautiful transformation, from the woman who had once needed the world's validation to the woman who found fulfillment in silence. Still, her journey wasn't free from ghosts. Gene's mental health remained fragile, and she continued to receive treatment throughout her life. But now she faced it without shame. She became an advocate, speaking openly about her struggles at a time when most stars hid theirs behind a curtain of perfection. She wanted people to know that beauty didn't protect you from pain, and fame didn't make you invincible. "I want others to see that you can go through hell and come out the other side," she said in an interview in the 1970s. Maybe not the same person, but still someone worth knowing. Her courage helped destigmatize mental illness, long before it was fashionable to speak of it. Fans who had once adored her for her face now admired her for her strength. Letters poured in, not from Hollywood insiders, but from ordinary people who saw in Gene's story a reflection of their own battles. Some thanked her for surviving. Others said her honesty saved them. For Gene, that meant more than any award. She said, "If my suffering can make someone else feel less alone, then maybe it wasn't all for nothing." Despite her retreat from Hollywood, Gene occasionally appeared at film retrospectives and interviews. When asked how she viewed her old movies, she smiled gently and said, "They are like dreams I once had." Watching herself on screen was both beautiful and painful. Beautiful because it reminded her of her youth, painful because it reminded her of what she lost to keep it. Yet she held no bitterness. "I had my time," she said softly, "and I'm grateful I survived it." In the 1970s, she published her memoir, Self-Portrait, which became an instant bestseller. The book was raw, unfiltered, and filled with grace. She didn't shy away from the darkness: her failed marriage, her mental illness, her daughter's condition, her brushes with despair. But she also wrote about gratitude, forgiveness, and resilience. Critics called it one of the most honest autobiographies ever written by a Hollywood star. For readers, it wasn't just a book, it was a lifeline. Her words resonated because they were real. She wasn't writing as a movie star trying to protect her image. She was writing as a woman who had nothing left to hide. The success of Self-Portrait surprised her. She hadn't written it for fame, but for freedom. "I wanted to leave behind something true," she said, "so that when people looked at that face on the screen, they would know the soul behind it." And in many ways, that book gave Gene something she'd lost years ago, a voice that wasn't scripted or directed but her own. Her daughter Daria remained in a special care facility throughout her life, and Gene visited her as often as she could. Those visits were bittersweet, filled with love, but also reminders of what could have been. Yet Gene found comfort in knowing her daughter was cared for and safe. "Her world is different from ours," she said once, "but it's still full of love." That kind of acceptance, and quiet, unconditional, and deeply human, was the truest form of beauty Gene ever showed. As the years passed and age softened her once perfect features, Gene didn't resist it. She welcomed it. She used to say, "The mirror used to frighten me. Now it reminds me that I'm still here." Her once sculpted face became lined with time, but those lines carried stories of love, loss, endurance, and redemption. And perhaps for the first time in her life, she looked in the mirror and saw not the world's image of her, but her own reflection. In her later years, Gene and Howard moved to Houston permanently. She enjoyed quiet evenings, surrounded by books and a few close friends. She rarely spoke about her films unless someone asked. To her, they were distant memories, pieces of another life she had long outgrown. When friends visited, they found her gracious, witty, and surprisingly grounded. She was no longer the fragile star. She was a woman who had made peace with her story. In 1991, after a long and rich life, Gene Tierney passed away at the age of 70. The newspapers wrote their headlines, "The most beautiful woman in the world dies at 70. But those who truly knew her knew the truth, that Gene Tierney had died not as a symbol of beauty, but as a symbol of survival. She had lived through heartbreak, mental illness, loss, and the crushing weight of fame, yet she never surrendered her soul. She endured, and that, in the end, is the greatest beauty of all. When fans look back at Gene Tierney's films, Laura, Leave Her to Heaven, Heaven Can Wait, The Ghost, and Mrs. Muir, they still see that face that once captivated the world. But if you look closer, past the surface, past the flawless features and elegant gestures, you'll see something else, a depth, a sadness, a truth. Every glance, every pause, every sigh she gave on screen came from a place of real experience. She wasn't acting pain. She was remembering it. Gene once said, "Beauty has been my curse and my blessing. It opened every door, and it also locked me in." That haunting line sums up her life perfectly. She paid a heavy price for perfection. Fame cost her privacy, love cost her peace, and her gift cost her sanity. Yet she still found the courage to live, to love again, and to tell her truth. That is the legacy she left behind. Today, when we look at old photographs of Gene Tierney, that luminous smile, those eyes that seem to hold both heaven and sorrow, we aren't just seeing a Hollywood star. We are seeing a woman who lived a full, painful, beautiful life. A woman who stumbled and rose again. A woman who showed the world that even the most beautiful face can hide the deepest wounds, and that true beauty is not in how perfect you look, but in how bravely you survive. Gene Tierney's story reminds us that behind every glamorous photograph, there's a soul fighting battles we may never see. And maybe that's why she continues to captivate new generations. Not because she was flawless, but because she was real. Beneath the silk gowns, beneath the camera lights, beneath the legend, she was a woman like any other, longing for love, peace, and the freedom to simply be herself. So as we fade out on this story, her story, we remember Gene Tierney not just as the beauty who graced the silver screen, but as the woman who showed us that even the brightest stars can shine through darkness. And perhaps that's what makes her unforgettable. Because in the end, Gene Tierney didn't just play the part of a tragic beauty, she lived it, and she transcended it.